Such a journalist.
Thank you.
Susan's our marketing expert. All these cute displays is Susan, right?
I thought it was just that it was invisible.
Oh, very good. Good job, Andrew. How about it? And thank you all for coming out on a night where the temperature is dropping to Colorado sort of levels here. It's all your fault. We're delighted to have Andrew Grant back to see us for what he reminds me is his 8th consecutive visit. So we're thrilled. And invisible is the start of something new. So, Andrew, what was, I'm not going to ask you where you got your idea, that would be so trite. What interested you in the idea of sending someone to work in a job that more or less makes him invisible?
Thank you, Barbara. And again, it's a huge pleasure to be here, especially on a night when I understand there's some other kind of talk taking place, maybe in Washington, some other work of fiction, perhaps.
Oh my God!
It won't be as thrilling.
Let's hope not. But yeah, that was very kind what you said there about Invisible and the new character who works as a janitor. And the reason I wanted to make him a janitor really comes from two different angles that kind of came together. One of them was right from when I was really young. I was always fascinated by stories like The Scarlet Pimpernel, where you've got a hero who risks everything to right wrongs, but there's nothing in it for them. And not only is there no reward in it for them, other than the satisfaction of doing the right thing, they have to maintain their anonymity. People never find out who is doing all of these good things. That really, really intrigues me. And that tied into another book I read when I was a teenager that I really liked, and it's a long time ago, so I'm probably going to get all the detail wrong. But in the novel *The Castle* by Franz Kafka, it's this kind of weird, surreal world where everyone in this little village is ruled by people in this castle, and no one knows what's going on. It's impossible to tell because no one talks to one another. The ruling people, they don't even talk to one another. But it turns out there is in fact one guy who does know everything. It's not the king, it's not the ruler, it's not an aristocrat, it's the barber. Because everybody goes to him to get their hair cut, and they all talk to him. So the only person, and I guess, back then the idea that, knowledge was more important than money or status or anything was really appealing. And the only person that had the knowledge was the barber, So all of that was kicking away, lurking in the back of my mind. But on top of that, I really felt like over the last few years there's been a change in the mood in the country. There's been a sense of growing unfairness, growing inequality, growing corruption, and so on. So the idea that you've got a hero who stands up for us, the 99%, rather than standing up for the 1%, I thought was quite timely. And I think the idea that if things get really, really bad, there's a guy who might just pop up and be on your side is powerful.
So he's kind of a Superman guy, except in a cloak of invisibility. He has a mop and a bucket because, in fact, he's the janitor in the courthouse where he has gone to unearth information. So.
Yeah, and it was, there was a really time, sometimes you get, if you come up with an idea and you're trying to gauge whether it's a good idea or not, sometimes there are things that sort of fall into place and seem like they're affirming that. And I remember when, as I was saying, there are bits of this idea that have been kicking around in the back of my mind for ages, but when I got to the point where I thought, actually, yes, this is what I want to write about next, I called my agent and I said, okay, you might think I'm crazy, but I've got this idea. And so I explained it all to him. And as luck would have it, he had just come back from jury service. So he had just been in the
courthouse.
And not only a courthouse, the very courthouse that I wanted to write about in New York. And he said, you know what, that is brilliant because I was just there. And, when I think back, I think I can remember, seeing a guy going by with a mop and a bucket, but no one paid any attention to him. So, it's one of those things, it might not be front and center in your mind, but if you think about it, you think, yeah, actually, that does make sense. I can see that happen.
Well, in hospital mysteries, one of the great disguises for the bad guy is to grab a doctor's coat or a stethoscope or, an official-looking badge and kind of dodge around because people tend to overlook workers, people who have a reason to be there. In fact, since Andrew's British, we were talking earlier about the idea that servants in households were often treated just like furniture. That the people they worked for would often, just speak and act right in front of them in ways that we wouldn't think about doing, because you would be alert to them observing you, but they weren't. But you said something interesting about the fact that maybe servants would prefer that anonymity.
Yeah, we were talking about the idea that you have these different kinds of hierarchies, and because Tasha talks about this too, with doing all the research into the Victorian era in Britain, and you have different. I love things when they seem that you're going to look at them from one angle, but if you look from a different angle, it's a little bit more nuanced. So you have the idea, as Barbara was saying, that you'd have the aristocrats who would treat their servants as if they were pieces of furniture. And on the one hand, you'd think, well, that's horrible. Why would they be so arrogant? Why would they not at least take the time to talk to the people? And then it turned out that if you read any of the memoirs of people that worked in service, they would say that they actually hated it if any of the aristocrats tried to talk to them, because they had really hard jobs. They had to get the fire ready by 4 o'clock in the morning. They had to have the bath water, all of these things they had to do. They didn't have time to be sitting around getting patronized by some rich person. And at the same time, as Barbara was pointing out earlier, the hierarchy is different. The aristocrat might think that they're in charge of the household and that they're the most important person, but if you're the servant, it's going to be the butler or the housekeeper who's the most important.
All you Downton Abbey people will know exactly what we're talking about. No, seriously, there was a very strict hierarchy, but I do think that in all kinds of mysteries, there are invisible people. It could be the postman. Or the electric meter reader, or whatever it is, oftentimes turns out to be. I'm trying to remember, in Patricia Cornwell's first book, it was like the luggage handler, a serial killer disguised as the guy at the airport. It's surprising what you can get away with in a job where people expect to see you and don't pay any attention to you.
Yeah, that's right. And when you have something that people, a symbol, you're talking about somebody wearing a doctor's coat or something like that. In the last series, which featured a police detective, I got to be good friends with a retired detective, and he would tell me lots of stories about different cases that he'd worked on, and a lot of them part of it was very interesting, but also a little frustrating from a fiction writer's point of view, because he was saying that a lot of the time the criminals weren't really masterminds; they were just opportunists. And they generally got caught, not because of some master stroke by the detectives, but because of some stupid mistake they made. But a lot of the time what they would do would be latch on to something like putting on an overall so that they could walk into somewhere and people would just think they were a delivery guy, see them walking out with a bunch of stuff. They'd think, oh well, I've got an overall and there must be a return or something. So there were lots of things like that were really quite simple and superficial, but were enough to convince people.
Is it the Darwin Award? Is that the name of the one? The cleansing the gene pool, the truly stupid things that people do, and the stupidest one gets the award. But often it would go to criminals, like the guy that broke into the butcher shop or something and locked himself in the freezer and froze to death. Or, people who met interesting ends because they just weren't very smart.
Yeah, there was a brilliant one in the Darwin Awards where a guy went to rob a bank, and he was aware that it might be dangerous to speak because it might be getting recorded, that they might be able to figure out who he was. He had a balaclava on. So rather than risk speaking, he decided he would write down his demands. So he'd written them on a piece of paper, slipped them under the glass screen to the teller. But the only thing was that the piece of paper he'd chosen to write it on was a letter addressed to him at his own house.
Yes, well, there's a lot of fun. If you've never read them, they're really fun to go into and see the amazing things people can get up to. Well, another aspect of your book, because this is, if not the start of a series, at least we have to get to know your hero. He's coming back from being abroad, and he's expecting to take up his former life, but he doesn't get to, which also affects his decision, right?
That's right, yeah. The idea is that the hero is a guy called Paul McGrath, and he never really knew his mother. His mother died when he was very young, so he was raised by his father. And his father was not only a very, very successful businessman, but he was a committed pacifist. So his dream was that his son would follow him into the family business. So when Paul grew to teenage years, his way of rebelling was against his pacifist father, who wanted him to work in the business, was he went and joined the army. And he showed a real aptitude for intelligence work, so he got drafted into the intelligence division and had a really, really successful career in the army, and a few anecdotes from that come out in the book. But of course, over this period of time, what happened was that the one thing that was nagging at him from his earlier years was the fact that he left things on such bad terms with his father. So at the beginning of the book, he decides when his tour is up, he's going to leave the army, go back to New York and put things right with his father. But he never gets the chance to do that.
So that leaves him somewhat adrift. But the other good thing, and this is a really useful thing for a sleuth, is that he's in New York City, but fortuitously he has enough income. He can work as a janitor, but he doesn't actually have to live as a janitor in Manhattan, which would be pretty ugly.
It would, and that's one of the things that comes out in the book, is that it's another side to that point you were making about ignoring people like janitors. It's easy to ignore them, but try living your life if no one's cleaning the streets or cleaning the buildings, or we need these guys, and yet they don't have enough money to pay for childcare. They're expected to clean the buildings in Manhattan, but they don't get to live in the buildings in Manhattan. So
well, this is also true in places like Aspen and Santa Fe, and it's not just a Manhattan point. My larger point was actually to have a successful sleuth. You can't have somebody that is such a slave to trying to make an income that they haven't got time to go off sleuthing. And this is a broad, that's one reason we used to have a lot of clerical sleuths. We used to have Father Brown, we used to have Rabbi Winter, who's the one in, I can't, anyway. These are guys that are being paid a salary and have living accommodation, and they are invited to counsel people or, to do stuff. So Grantchester's coming back on, for example. Those aren't really mysteries, but it's very useful to have a sleuth who has enough of it. I guess that's why Lord Peter and Mr. Campion and all were also so popular, is that they were people with private incomes who could make sleuthing a hobby.
Yeah, I think that's a really essential thing, because when you're setting up the foundations for either a standalone character or a series, you have to establish certain things. Some of them are to do with the skills that your character's going to have. If he knows how to shoot a gun or escape from a locked room, you need to make it that it's credible that the person would know how to do those things. And likewise, as you say, it's no good if you have a character who gets up in the morning and says, well, I really would like to follow this lead I've just uncovered, but unfortunately I've got to go and work my 3 jobs today. And then, because it's very important that when you're reading a novel, that every decision your hero makes, be it a rational decision, an emotional decision, you have to believe it. And it might be a bit larger than life, it might be a bit exaggerated, but you still have to believe in that situation that person would do that thing. And we were talking earlier, I have this myself, I have a rule that is, if you are reading a book and you think, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't he have just dialed 911? You can't really believe in it after that. There was a fabulous example, it was a spoof movie. Did any of you see the Johnny English movies with Rowan Atkinson? They were James Bond spoofs, essentially. And in the second one of these, there's a scene set somewhere like Hong Kong, where there's the sort of standard fight between the Johnny English character and the bad guy on the roof of some exotic building. And Johnny English is getting the upper hand, so the bad guy jumps over the side of the building, grabs onto this rickety bamboo scaffolding that leads down to the ground floor. And any normal movie, then the hero would have jumped after him, and they'd both almost have fallen to their death several times before just about making it. But in this movie, what he does is he looks over, he sees the guy on the rickety scaffolding, so instead of jumping over after him, he just strolls across to the elevator, gets in, calmly rides down to the ground floor, and comes out right when the guy's getting down there. And that's it's a comic example, but if there's an easier way or a safer way or a more sensible way, I don't normally talk about other authors' books, but I guess in his case he probably isn't going to mind too much. But remember The Firm by John Grisham? You've got the character that Tom Cruise plays in the movie, who is taken on as a lawyer for this firm that turns out to be mobbed up, and the guy has joined the firm in whatever small town it is, somewhere down south, and he is starting to realise that everything isn't as it seems to be. Nothing has been revealed yet. He doesn't know anything. He's got no secrets whatsoever. He's just getting a sense that things are dodgy. And then the FBI contacts him. They make contact in a store, and they say to him, your employers work for the mob, and either you help us or we're going to make trouble for you, right? And of course, the firm is watching him. They know he's made contact with the FBI. So in the book, what do? Right? They launch this whole complicated scheme to murder him, right? Whereas I was reading that, I was thinking, well, no, he doesn't know anything yet. What they do is they call him into the office and say, sorry, mate, things haven't worked out. Here's 10 grand, go away. You know, why would you, given that the FBI is already looking at you, embark on some crazy homicide scheme? You wouldn't. It's too dangerous. These guys aren't fools. They would say, okay, didn't work out with him. Well, it didn't work out anyway, did it? Because they were going to kill him. So, wouldn't it be cheaper just to give him a few quid and tell him to go away? So, everything like that, I always try to be really careful to ensure that whenever there's a decision, you might not stop to think about it too clearly, but it's not something. It's like you're walking down the sidewalk. You don't want there to be a paving slab that's sticking up and trips you up. You wouldn't notice if it's flat, but if it's sticking up and it trips you up, then it's a problem. So I always try to maintain that kind of logic.
Well, there's another aspect to this too, which is that you can't burden him with people to look after. It's always, Respawn and I were having lunch yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that once she decided to, at some point, Molly Murphy either had to marry the police captain or move on. You can only do that for so many books. And, they're Catholic, and it's the turn of the 20th century, and there's not a lot of birth control around, and so inevitably, unless she wanted to create some catastrophic medical event or something, they were going to have children, right? And once they have a couple of children, it becomes really hard to go sleuthing. It's the same problem as if you have to go to work. So your guy comes back, and he's single. What if you brought him back and he had like a wife and 2 kids, and they'd come home, from Iraq or something? It would have been a whole different ballgame, right?
I think the only time that I can recall off the top of my head where anything like that has worked has been, remember the Len Dayton series that was set in the Cold War? And he had the 3 trilogies with the Bernard Sampson character.
Yeah.
And that was one, that was a big influence on me early on, because I was just fascinated by the way he had the setup that he had this guy, Bernard Sampson, who worked for MI6, and he was in line to take over the British spying operation in East Germany. So he was constantly having to go to East Berlin and do spy things, and then get back over the wall and get back to the West. His wife also worked for MI6. And so you had this whole deal where one day he would be trying to get over the Berlin Wall and escape, and then the next day he'd be back in London with his wife, and they'd be saying, well, wait, who you didn't get any more cornflakes? What are we going to have for breakfast? So that was the rare example where somebody was able to do something like that. But normally, you're right. I mean, you can't have the two because one takes away from the other.
Now, here's a regular question, because we just did a workshop on Sunday, and this whole thing came up. How much information about Paul are you going to tell us up front, and how much are you going to gradually reveal as he's going about his plan to, go undercover in the courthouse? How do you know how much to say and when?
That's a really good question, and I think that for me, there are two things which combine to answer that. One of them is, and the more important one is, I think it's almost an instinctive thing. It's just something that you learn over the years. You just have a feeling for how much to put in and when. But the other thing is, it depends on what you have in mind for. I'm hoping that this will turn into a series. So people talk about that having an arc in a series, where you have a storyline that continues beyond just the one book. And so Paul's family is going to be quite an important part of that arc. So actually there are things in this book that I've planted that there are little seeds in this book that are going to loom in subsequent ones, particularly in the second one, which I'm working on at the moment. So what I'm hoping is that if you guys are kind enough to read the second one, that you'll say, oh yeah, I remember when he's, things that perhaps didn't mean too much in this book, didn't stand out too much, but hopefully when you read subsequent ones, you'll think, oh yeah, I see where that came from.
I remember Larry King said to me that when you're setting up something like a first book, it's like packing a trunk for a journey. You have to put this stuff in it, because if you didn't put it in, you can't take it out later. But it also handicaps you in that if that's the stuff you put in, you can't subsequently disavow it. So it's a tough balancing act, isn't it? How much to seed in the book for future books, and then how much you're going to be stuck with.
Yeah, and how much of it you do deliberately, because there's the analogy that Laurie came up with there, where you're deliberately packing the trunk. But then I've also heard it described as, I forget the name of the show now. Remember there was a cooking show on TV where the contestants were given a fridge full of ingredients, and they had to make something out of those ingredients. So people often talk about it in those terms as well. You just have to work with whatever happens to be there. So it just depends on whether you're proactive like Laurie and you think about putting those things in the first place, or whether you're more reactive and you just say, okay, well, what happens to be there, and what am I going to do with it?
Okay, that seems like a good point. I was about to make a brilliant point, and my whole mind just froze. It's like a cold fry. I must have been drinking something cold. All right, it will come back to me. But so Paul, how set the stage, for the very opening parts, because that doesn't ruin it. Here he is. How do we meet him?
Well, when we meet Paul, he is in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, in Turkey, and
it's a great scene. I've been there. He did that very well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little self-indulgent because I love Istanbul. It's one of my favorite places in the world.
And clearly the Grand Bazaar. Yeah. And the spice market.
Yeah, and the actual store where the first scene is as well. We bought a carpet in that store.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. So Tasha took me there the first time for a birthday one year, and I just loved it. I loved it. On the way from the airport in a cab, the cab driver, he heard Tasha's accent, realized she was American, and said, "Oh yeah, I just love New York. It's so much easier to drive around." So, okay, well, if New York traffic seems light in comparison, we're going to be in for a fun ride. So yeah, I love it. I love Istanbul, and it felt like the right kind of setting, because one of the fun things about writing any book, really, and particularly when you're starting a new series, is all of the research you get to do. So I was thinking about the idea of a guy who'd worked in military intelligence, and I started to think about, well, what kind of training would he have had, what kind of missions would he have been involved in. So I started reading a lot of memoirs and a lot of non-fiction about some of the real missions that some of the different intelligence services around the world have been involved in, and some of the most interesting ones actually were ones that the Mossad had done, and some of the stuff has come to light recently. Remember there was that Stuxnet computer worm that was used to destroy the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. That was fantastic, and that was a kind of joint thing between the CIA and Mossad. But Mossad themselves have done some really cool stuff, and a lot of it is to do with trying to stop Iran from creating nuclear weapons. So I read a load of things about the kind of things that are done to sabotage that attempt. So that really inspired that first scene. I thought, this is something that my guy could be involved in. And of course, if you're going to be going to somebody like the Iranians and trying to sabotage their nuclear weapon program, you don't advertise that. You have to do it pretty clandestinely. So the opening scene is Paul arriving to sell some piece of contraband equipment to the Iranians. That of course they have to figure out, is it real, or is this another setup run by some enemy power? So I had real fun creating this first scene where the Iranians were going to some lengths to try to test Paul to find out if he was legitimate or not.
So, but you put it in there not because it's actually part of the story that you're going to develop, but to tell us who Paul is. I mean, some of the characteristics. I remember now what it was I was going to say. Which is, since you have to start a series or a book, rather, with characters at some point in time, I think in series, this is one reason authors are driven to write prequels. Because, you know, after you've written them for a while, there's stuff about them that you may have had in the trunk or probably didn't, but there's stuff about them that now you want to write about or you want us to know. And you have to go back in time because here you were at the beginning. You know, with Michael Conley, it was book 4. I'm trying to think over the years of the prequels. Charles Finch, who's going to be here in a couple of weeks, he's writing a prequel trilogy, which I think is interesting. This will be book 2 of the trilogy that precedes the actual start of Charles Lennox's life, because there was a lot to explore about Charles before we meet him in A Beautiful Blue Death. So, you know, you can keep that in mind. And that might be an argument for not making the stuff on the trunk that overt.
That's right, and sometimes you figure some of that out as you go, I guess. But I remember there was some writer called Lee something who he had some.
I was actually just going to say.
He's done a few prequels.
His most recent book is not a prequel necessarily, but goes back to figure out what was going on with his father, right?
But I remember when he
even Reacher has some baggage and some pre-life.
A lot of baggage. Yeah, he has a lot of baggage.
But I remember when he did his first prequel, and then after a while he did one that came between that prequel and Killing Floor.
Right.
So he called that one the prequel sequel.
Which is lovely. I've always liked that. Right. We had an author who I used to say wrote the sequel to the prequel, so it could have gone the other way. And unfortunately got to it sort of late and then died, which was really too bad. But I do think, you know, to really explore character, you're almost driven in a long series to move around in time a bit. You can't always just go forward.
Yeah, that sort of linear narrative is really hard to stick to sometimes, because you really do need to. It stems back to the oldest of cliches that you've got to show, not tell. You know, as you were saying, that opening scene. Well, it was really fun to write because it has action, it has intrigue, it has a great location, all of that stuff. Really, its fundamental purpose is that it's showing Paul, and it shows his skills and it shows his capabilities, because the book is mostly written in first person, which has some really good advantages in terms of telling the story. But it also has some problems, because if you're writing in first person, you can't have your character saying, "Hey, I'm really sneaky, me. You know, I can do all these cool things." You can't have him saying that. You know, third person you can describe it. You have someone else describing it. First person you can't. So you have to make sure that you have a way of you've got to show the character in action. So I thought that having an opening scene that absolutely showed what he can do was the good start. And the other thing in the back of my mind was, remember that old, like the Sean Connery James Bond movies, you know, they always open with an action sequence. And so I kind of had that in my mind, that, you know, I wanted something that popped off the page right away that hopefully captured the reader's imagination.
So did the first one that, what's his name, the recent guy. I thought that the opening scene of the first James Bond that he did with the rooftop chase and all, remember it ended and then it ended again? That was one of the truly great opening action scenes in a movie. It was just, why can't I think of having senior moments? Was this called Skyfall?
That was also Istanbul, wasn't it? The rooftop chase was, they were riding motorcycles over the roof of the
something like, and then the beauty of it was, you thought it was over, you know, and then it went again, you know, and the second one was such a surprise, and so effective. But yeah, if you're going to have a hero, and if you're going to give him, you know, the janitor's job, it's good for the reader to know he can do other stuff, you know, before.
And then when he starts doing that stuff, you can get straight on with it. You don't have to then have some some diversion where you establish it later.
So, you know, you're not a guy that is actually served in the military, are you? Or have you?
No, I haven't.
But your first guy that you wrote about was in the Navy, if I recall, and now you've got a guy in military intelligence. What draws you, you know, to them?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think, you know, part of it is practical, because, as we were saying earlier, you need to establish how your character is going to plausibly have, you know, a range of skills of that nature. So I think the military is an obvious place for that. But I think in terms of mentality, even though, you know, I didn't serve myself, my father did, and generations are quite stretched out in my family. So my father was actually in World War II. So he was 20 years old when they landed in Normandy, and so obviously that was a relatively short span of his life, but it completely influenced everything that he did and how, so that even the way that he always had a military kind of slant to how he talked, how he thought, how he, if we were going on vacation, that was a military exercise, and so I think that a lot of that permeated into me while I was growing up, and I think there's a certain mindset when I finished university. I had a difference of opinion with my father. I wanted to set up a theatre company. He wanted me to become a civil servant because he thought theatre companies are very risky. You don't make any money. It's easy to lose your job. Whereas if you're a civil servant, it's going to be safe. It's going to be secure.
Which concept we've recently blown apart.
Well, we have. But I didn't want to do that. I did not want to be a civil servant. But as a sort of compromise, he suggested to me, we had this period of time where the 6 of us that were going to set up this theatre company, we had to go up. We agreed we were going to go away for 6 months to earn the money that we needed to found the company. And he was saying to me, well, can you guarantee that all the other 5 are going to show up with the money in their hand on the day? And of course, I couldn't guarantee that. So he said, okay, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you take the test for the civil service? And that way, just, keep it in your back pocket, and then if the other guys don't show up, at least you've got something to fall back on. So I thought, well, you can't really argue with that. It's fair enough, because I had faith in my friends. I thought they would show up. I thought I would never have to do this. So I show up, and I do this whole day of tests. They're those kind of psychometric tests, where you start off in the morning and you're sort of paying attention to them, and after a few hours, your brain is just fried and you can't really think about it too much. So I think that's how they're supposed to work, really. So you can't mess with the results. It's just whatever is really you. So I do this whole day of tests, and I walk away and I'm young and I'm arrogant, and I'm thinking, well, because my dad was a civil servant in his later years, so I thought, well, if the old man can get in, I'm bound to get in. And then about a week later, I get a letter in the mail saying, thank you for showing interest, but unfortunately, you didn't get in. So I was like, what? How did this happen? So I was kind of reeling from it. And the next day, another letter arrived saying, we know that you recently applied for the civil service and that it turned out that you weren't a match for them, but we're a different branch of the government and we might have an opportunity that might be interesting to you. So if you'd like to pursue it further, you could show up to such and such an address on Tottenham Court Road in London at 9 o'clock on whatever day. So I think, oh, this is intriguing. I wonder what this is all about. So it's a bit vague about which part of the government it was for. So I went along and I found this address on Tottenham Court Road, and it was just this anonymous, very narrow sort of, you go in and there's really just, it was narrow, there was just a desk with some guy who was wearing just a plain suit, but you could see the suit didn't fit particularly well, and so, I gave my name and they took me up. And first of all, I had to do a few more tests, which they then said they wanted me to wait while they marked them on the spot. Then they took me through to this room. It was like a very plain office. And actually there was some really, really obvious of those sort of interview tricks going on. It was a summer day, the sun was streaming in, but the blind was open. There was some water, but it was far away. And all the things to see if you were going to just sit there, or if you were going to close the blind, and if you were going to go and get the water and everything. Then a woman came in and she wanted to, she started talking to me, but there was no discernible subject. It was just all current affairs stuff. And what I realised she was trying to do was trying to get me to commit, like somebody or other was on strike, so she was trying to get me to commit either in favour of the strikers or in favour of the employer. And so the more I realised she was trying to push me to commit one way or the other, I made sure to stay on the fence, all things like that. So that went on for about an hour. And at the end she said, okay, well, if, this is very interesting, we would like to talk to you some more, but if we do, we're going to need you to sign these papers. And I had a look, and it was a thing in England called the Official Secrets Act. Because it turned out, nowadays it's all a lot more public, but at the time, what it was recruitment for MI5. So, I figured that there must have been something in all of those tests that they did that, reveals the way you think and whatever, that was in line with what they were looking for. So even though I never did it, I felt like, you know, there was something sort of, you know,
So
inherent.
you could either be a spy or write fiction.
Exactly.
Or a novelist, which, you know, I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of crossover characteristics there, so, wow, well, that's really fascinating. To end our little conversation here, I could say that in many ways this is a quest novel. You know, you have him, you know, he comes home and there he is, and then he takes up a quest and he figures out a role in which he might be able to, you know, fulfill his quest. And then what I like, without revealing what happens to you, is that he starts out, this is a purely personal, selfish thing. But as he does it, he gets to a place where he realizes that he might be able to, in fact, help other people, especially if he keeps this job. So we'll leave it on that level.
Well, I just wanted to throw in one other little detail, if I may, which is that a lot of the research I had to do for this book was all around financial fraud and real estate dealing, strangely enough. And
not in New York.
strangely enough. And one thing that I discovered, which actually has turned out to be quite timely, is that I've noticed in the news recently there's been a lot of talk about a real estate deal which apparently was proposed in some kind of previous Soviet capital. And this deal never went ahead, and you know, there's been a lot of speculation about does that mean anything or not. One of the things I discovered when I was doing all the research for the book, and it's mentioned in there, the details are in there, it turns out, and obviously I'm not for a moment suggesting that anything like this might have happened in real life, but it turns out that a really common vehicle for cleaning dirty money and bringing it into the United States is failed real estate deals abroad. So just in case you're looking for any timely and current storylines.
I keep hoping I'm going to actually live long enough to see how all of this plays out, you know, because there are so many different things going on, and it would be sad to exit without ever knowing the end of the story. So we'll see how it works out. So I would like to thank our Facebook audience for joining us this evening. If any of you, when you later would like to go to our Facebook page and share this to your own Facebook page, you can do that, or you